pronounce things incorrectly, especially French words and also people's names. I think that has something to do with my disability. I'm not sure. Pronunciation's hard for me in some cases. Fanon in the colonial psychiatry. Have I not, because of what I have done or failed to do, contribute to an impoverishment of human reality? Fanon, Towards an African Revolution. That is another good book by Fanon. To take up healing as a career assumes a degree of empathy with victims of diseases, if not with people. Among the crucial sources of empathy are first a recognition, conscious and unconscious, of one's vulnerability, and second, kind of informative identification, generally the values one has internalized, yet empathy and regard for others are never absolute or dominant features in human relations. Like other qualities, they are contextual and historically determined. Group interest and shared biases inform to whom one may feel appropriately empathetic, which may lead to projecting oneself into another subjective state and appearing fused with the other, or to whom one may feel animosity, which can involve distance, degenerating, and abusing. Wait. Yeah. A situation of oppression not only opposes rigid boundaries between people, it also corrupts those who profess to heal. The psychiatry, one of the specialties that deals with wildness, ostensibly aims at the improvement, not the impoverishment of human reality. But stated goals are one thing, actually practice quite another. We have already seen how prevailing definitions of psychopathology, the process of diagnosis, and the pattern of confinement or over-medication are influenced by such realities of social societies as inequities of power, ethnocentrism, class basis, and racism. The French psychiatric establishment with which Fanon had to contend tellingly illustrates an oppressive psychiatry, and Fanon's attempt to reformulate it offers a valiant example of a struggle against such psychiatries. This chapter discusses Fanon's quest for relevance, first in the land of his birth and later in Algeria. His search for an appropriate context was also a search for himself, what to live and die for. Psychiatry promised a means for making a living and also a tool for correcting what he found amiss. However, learning its established theories and techniques proved insufficient. Fanon's Algerian experience underscored the need for a profound reevaluation in theories and practice. Hence, a direct confrontation of establishment psychiatry itself was inevitable. This chapter highlights Fanon's clinical reforms in a colonial setting and his single-handed challenge of the French psychiatric establishment, particularly in so-called Algeria School of Psychiatry. Beginnings and next section, beginning a career in psychiatry. Following the defense of this medical thesis on November 1951, Fanon left France with his brother Joby to return to Martinique. He soon took up medical practice in the island, only to realize that the essential problems facing Martinicans were political and economic. Most of the patients who came to see him suffered from maladies and primary causes of which were nutritional deficiency, poor sanitation, and poor public health practices. The possibilities of fundamental social reform seemed remote. French domination had long permeated every aspect of Martinican life. The economy, the structure, and the psyche were deeply penetrated. The Beckes, Bekes, a wealthy white aristocracy, was as powerful and hostile as ever. Poverty was rife, alienation rampant, and alcoholism pervasive. The latter as Grimsmer, Geismar, pointed out, served well as the opium of the masses. What could smell? You could smell it in every laboring sweat, in the air of the city, central square, or narrow streets. Rum was dispensed in cafes clustering the port area, in cafes surrounding the Savanie, in the cafes near the marketplace. It was sold by the bottle in stores near Fanon's suburban home. It was available from the streetcar next to the Fanon's office. Oblivion was never more than 50 feet away in any direction. Fanon wished to work towards a reform of this situation, but in 1952 he couldn't find a place to begin. Fanon became a revolutionary several years later in Algeria, and the Algerian liberation struggle had much to do with his becoming a revolutionary. Yet to argue that he accidentally stumbled into revolutionary Algeria, or that he disassociated himself from Martinique, and from politics for professional reasons, is to miss Fanon's deep and persistent commitment to the cause of social justice. One could very well imagine the personal anguish Fanon felt on his return to Martinique. The man who earlier wrote Black Skins, White Masks, 1976, would hardly have taken a complacent attitude towards the poverty, alienation, the powerlessness rampant in Martinique. 30 years later, when I visited the island in 1982, on occasion of the First International Memorial of Fanon in Martinique, I could still sense what may have forced him away from the island. To this day, the island is effectively under colonial domination. The black petty bourgeoisie and his revered teacher, Amin Césaire, yeah, now the deputy mayor of Fort-de-France, are in no mood for independence. Much of the population still identifies with France, to such an extent that some Martiniquans consider Fanon a traitor for siding with the Algerians against France. And to this day, people consider a visit to France a mark of having, quote, arrived at where else but, quote, La Bas, L-A, space B-A-S. As if the only place or only worthwhile place beyond the island of France. In any case, Fanon felt Martinique to be specialized in psychiatry. In November 1951, he was admitted to the psychiatric residency program in Hospital de Saint-Alban, I can't say it, in central France, where professional Francisco Torskiles had established a national reputation for a pioneer in therapeutic institutionally, it's all in French, sorry, which was the equivalent of Malou therapy. Let's find out what Malou therapy is. Malou therapy, even if I'm saying it right, because I think that's important. M-I-L, I-E-U-E. No, I did two L's, didn't I? It's one L. There it is. A structured relationship-based treatment method that transforms a patient everyday environment into a therapeutic community. Okay. All right. Okay. He supervised Fanon during his residency, and by 1953 presented 3 papers with Fanon at the Professional Conference for Psychiatrists and Neurologists of France and French-speaking countries. Okay, Torskiles, I don't know if innovation in psychiatric treatment are well summarized in one of 3 papers. The paper reflects its time, but it also anticipates change that were to be incorporated into psychiatric care in various countries. The article is primarily concerned with the indication and Contradictions. Oh, that's a hard word. Contradictions. I don't know if that's contradictions. That doesn't spell contradiction. And it does not spell contradiction. It spells something else. Contrarain. There it is. Oh my gosh, no. Come on. Why is it not letting me do it? Oh my god. It won't let me pronunciate. All right. Everybody get ready for this Pizza Hut.
How do you pronounce this word? It's a counterintuitive pronunciation. I know the spelling is confusing.
Oh my god.
Contraindication.
Contraindication. Contraindication. That's what it says. Contraindication of electroconvulsive. Wait. Electroconvulsive. Wait. Convulsive. Yeah. Electroconvulsive therapy. ECT. Which at the time was frequently used for diverse psychiatric disorder. The authors deplored the use of ECT merely, quote, out of convenience for the psychiatrist, but conceded that it is one of, quote, the ultimate remedies in chronic, desperate complication cases where the post-therapeutic defect would be a minor problem in the face of progressive mental deterioration of the patient. Recommending the appropriate use of ECT, they also challenged the then prevalent theoretical basis for biogenic explanations and assumed fixity of the character, constitution, and pathological development of personality. So fixity is something. I think it's like a fixed position. Because I looked this up. It's also a philosophical term. And I've seen fixity. The state or equal of being permanently fixed, stable, or unchanged. Okay, yeah, I was right. Fixity of character, constitution, and pathological development of personality. They further emphasized the role of psychological causation and the necessary role of ECT in the framework of institutional therapy. Here's a little quote. We insist on the fact that for treating patients with ECT, it is necessary at the same time to accord much importance to the hospital arrangement to classification and grouping of the patients and the establishment of concomitant group therapy. Concomitant, yeah. The coexistence of the ward for work and social life of the entire hospital is also indispensable as the stage of activity, interventionist analysis that precedes the care. The benign cure without a possibility of an interventionist series of therapy appears to us as nonsense. The institutional therapy did not, of course, start in St. Alban or with Tosquinley's Melu therapy, and the notion of the therapeutic community was first introduced during the 1930s and 1940s in England and in the United States. Jones, 1953, Maine, 1946, and Sullivan, 1933. What was special about Tosquinley's was his methodical, rigorous application of such the intervention of St. Albans. The spontaneous everyday experience of patients within the institutions were used therapeutically. Efforts were made to create ordinary experiences as they are lived in society, and the patients were grouped into, quote, life communities, consisting of no more than 10 to 12 persons. They regularly interacted with one another, sometimes in smaller groups, and with the large community of patients in the institution through centralized coordinated functions. Spontaneous interactions put a maximum therapeutic value were combined with structured group therapy, occupational therapy, and regular meetings. At all times, patients were encouraged to confront one another and themselves to gain maximum, quote, insight into their illness, end quote. Special care was taken to work with the optimal numbers of patients and to group doctors into medical teams, and 2 or 3 so that they could become intimately involved in a life community. One doctor alone was said to hinder the resolution of Oedipal. I'm going to look that word up, everybody, because I can't remember what it meant. Oh, hey, look, it's another person. Hey, it is Incoherent. Nice to meet you. Oedipal. Oedipal. A child's unconsciousness feeling of desire of their opposite sex parents and a sense of rivalry or jealousy towards the same sex parent. Okay, this is like the Epidus, I think. And hold on. Oedipal. Where did it go? Sorry, everybody. Conflicts of patients. The other 2 papers, jointly authored by Tosquelles and Fanon, 1953, provided case illustrations to underscore the efficacy of their approach to treatment. After about 2 years of work with Tosquelles, Fanon, I'm saying that name wrong, everybody. Fanon left St. Alban. He sat for Les Médicats and Hospital Psychiatric. It's all in French. The difficult intensive examinations that, if passed, confers upon one the coveted qualification to be chief service in the major psychiatric institution in France or in one of its colonies. Fanon successfully completed this difficult examination, in which less than 1/3 passed that year. He was subsequently offered the dictatorship of a hospital in Martinique. Fanon didn't accept it. However, Grismer suggests that he declined because, quote, there were no facilities there for psychiatric care or research. This is simplistic and unconvincing. We believe Fanon's refusal to accept the offer had to do with the stagnant socio-political conditions that had previously made Martinique unattractive. The fact that he wrote to Léopold Senghor, president of Senegal, and one of the advocates of negritude, and inquired about the possibilities of service in Senegal, suggests that more was actually involved than the availability of, quote, the equipment for electroshock treatment, insulin therapy, and extensive ergotherapy. As Grimsmar claimed, unfortunately, Senghor did not respond to Fanon's letter. Fanon then settled for a temporary assignment at Chief D Service in the psychiatric hospital of Pontorson in Normandy. Not surprisingly, he worked in the eerie isolation of the psychiatric hospital at Pontorson was short-lived. The almost total absence of contact with the black world at Pontorson was not at all what Fanon wanted, even though his commitment to the psychiatric profession was intense. Then the opportunity to work in Algeria presented itself, and Fanon immediately seized it. He applied for and was offered the position in Chief D Service in Blendoville Hospital in Algeria. Grimser surmised that what the new assignment meant to Fanon. It was a compromise, part of the developing world, but not Black Africa or the Antilles. There are 3 questions worth asking at this point. First, was going to Algeria a compromise as Grimser suggested? Second, did Fanon opt out of political and social concerns during his residency and soon after its completion? as some, including Gizmer, have claimed. Third was Tosquenlin's, can't say his name right, influence so fundamental that Fanon simply have followed in the footsteps of his teacher, as Grisner emphasizes. Little exists by way of direct evidence to answer these questions. Fanon wrote no autobiography of his own, and, as we pointed out earlier, he believed that those who write their memoirs have nothing else to do in the world. Thus, the answer of these questions depend on who had interviewed, and frankly, the interpretation to which one has predisposed, Grismer intended to view Fanon's involvement with political and social issues as interruptions, quote unquote, of his career in psychiatry. Grisner, for her own reason, emphasized the towering stature of Tosquenlin's and the loyalty of his student to Tosquenlin's, I can't say this name right, innovation, which we are told Fanon applied in a mechanical fashion. Are you able to talk? Hey, Brianna, are you able to talk, Joe? On here? Are you there, Joe? They must not be there. They're probably busy. In our view, the choice of Algeria was not a compromise. Fanon did not opt out of social and political concerns, neither during his residency or at Pontorson. And the Tosquenlinian influence, I can't say his name right, though important in his formative years, was by no means the only guide for inspiration to Fanon's practice of rehabilitating alienated psyches. Support for these contentions is offered by one significant article Fanon wrote, The Northern African Syndrome, quote unquote. It originally appeared in February 1952, issued in Els Esprit. The article, written during his residency, shows that racism and oppression were central concerns for Fanon, and that he also deeply emphasized, as well as identified with Northern Africans, long before he came chief de service in Algeria. Moreover, it suggests that Fanon was never satisfied with prevailing medical practices with respect to the oppressed, nor was he convinced that formative tinkering was institutional malus is sufficient while the question of social justice remains. So he's saying that, like, with all these contradictions and these alienations, it still remains. So yeah, we will see later that Fanon significantly depart from Tosquenlin's in theory and practice. The article, quote, the North African Syndrome, end quote, is a incisive critique of racism in society and in the medical establishment. In addition, it shows the depth of the psycho-existential crisis, diffuse malice, and wandering syndrome of the oppressed. Underscored, it is the inability of the medical professions to comprehend the North African patient, as well as the failure of medical doctors to take a clear, responsible, and responsive position on racism and social justice. Not only do the misdiagnoses and profound exclusive afflictions of the oppressed, they also readily assumed racist views and attitudes. The article began with a question Fanon thought basic to all human problems, and, no doubt, he frequently asked himself, quote, have I not, because of what I have done, or failed to do, contributed to the impoverishment of human reality? In other words, Fanon asked, have I at all times demanded and brought the man that is in me? Are you there, Joe? Hold on. Yeah, are you there, Joe? Joe! Oh well. Fanon then proceed to show the various expressions of racism. The pervasive malice it produces, and the inability of standard medical practice to diagnose or treat the oppressed effectively. One remarkable facet of Fanon, here as elsewhere, was his capacity to adopt the perspectives of various protagonists, to delve into the affective particularity of each perspective, and to reveal the existential unsaltery. Okay, unsalter. Oh my gosh, I don't know how to say this word. I don't know. Joe's not there. I don't know why Joe's not saying anything. I'll have to send him a text here soon. Not there. There. I think I almost got this word right.
Insularity.
No, I didn't even get it close. Insularity. A state of being isolated, detached, or separated, much like an island. So let me go back to, where's the beginning of the sentence? One remarkable facet of Fanon here, as elsewhere, was his capacity to adopt the perspective of various protagonists, to delve into the effective particularity of each perspective, and to reveal the existential insularity of each group, oppressor and oppressed alike. Excuse me. In addition, there is his remarkable use of sarcasm and humor to show the, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, this is another one. I wish I could remember definitions and pronounce things better. Wish I was good at it. Oh, it's not gonna let me say it. Something that is okay. Hold on. Pronunciation. Oh, of course. Ready for another freaking. It's a game now.
Tragic.
Oh my gosh.
What's on
Tragicomic.
Tragic comical absurdities and characterizing. Oops, my bad, everybody. Oh my gosh. Absurdities and characterize oppression. The issue discussed in this article were actually taken up years later in Dying Colonialism, The Wretched of the Earth, and The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon proposed three central theses in the 1952 article. The first states that North African patients in France often cause the medical staff to have doubts as to the reality of their illness. A patient comes in to the physician with a great deal of pain, which is obviously from his words or comportment, but his vague complaints and wandering syndromes illustrate in the following interview do not fit standards ideological conceptions of diagnostic procedures. The doctor inquires into the circumstance and experience that precedes the ailment. But such inquiries about the past is for the oppressed too painful to remember, to talk about. Besides, he does not understand why he should be so interrogated when what he really needs is quick relief from the tormenting diffuse pain. The dialogue between patients and doctors recreates the tragic comical misunderstanding of the colonial situation. Here it is. What's wrong, my friend? I'm dying, monsieur. Where does it hurt? In my belly. He then points to his thorax and abdomen. When does it hurt? All the time. Even at night? Especially at night. It hurts more at night than in the daytime? Does it? No, all the time. But more at night than in daytime? No, all the time. And where does it hurt most? Here. He then points at his thorax and abdomen. Meanwhile, other patients are waiting. The doctor, now impatient, seeks a way out of this frustrating impasse. He approximates a diagnosis and writes out a prescription. But the patient fails to follow the doctor's recommendation. And if he does take the prescribed medicine, he does not give it time to have a desired effect. Unable to attain immediate relief, the patient returns. The patient returns much earlier than instructed. He is indignant and suspicious because he believes that the doctor does not really want to help him, or he may decide to seek treatment elsewhere, repeating time and again the same vague complaints, the same drama of mutual incomprehension and suspicion between doctor and patient. The pain of which the patient complains is so often gradually becomes, quote, his pain, and intensely cathartic. This pain comes to have a reality of social dynamics of its own, and the patient shows that he jealously wants to protect whatever secondary gain he may derive from it. An X-ray may show an ulcer or gastritis. Treatment in accordance to standard medical procedures may be provided. The doctor is now confident. He regains his sense of omnipotence, or at least feels relief in the knowledge that he can now get rid of this patient. But the patient soon returns, this time with a different complaint. My heart seems to flutter inside here, or my head is bursting. Instead of attempting to comprehend and treat the patient's specific affliction, the tormenting social historical conditions that produced it, the doctor resorts to ordinary stereotypes of the North African, called the patient, quote, a simulator, a liar, a malingerer, a slugger, a thief. The second and related thesis states that the racist traditions medical personnel have long internalized hinders appropriate diagnosis and treatment of North African. There is on the one hand the medical dogma that the liaison underlines symptoms, and on the other the cultural racism that stereotypes the North African as a person who is lazy and inarticulate and who suffers from imaginary ailments. The doctor is urgently summoned to the home of the seriously ill North African immigrant. The relatives are ostensibly worried and distressed. They are weeping and screaming. The doctor carefully examines the patient. He asks questions but gets only groans and vague responses in return. After considering the examination and thought, he refers the patient for surgery. To the surprise of the doctor, the patient with the, quote, abdominal requiring surgery turns up in his office with a grin 3 days later, completely cured. This, of course, deviates from the standard medical traditions, conceptions, and procedures. The doctor henceforth quickly resorts to a diagnosis of, quote, North African syndrome, end quote. Sounds racist. I shouldn't probably say that. Hello. Which implies malingering, lies, laziness, and all the other stereotypes. In short, in the conflict of oppressors and oppressed, the doctor sides with the former in outlook and practice. He is best patronized the oppressed, but remains loyal to the prevailing culture stereotypes. The North African patient, viewed no longer as an individual in his own right, is made to, quote, bear the dead weight, end quote, of his dispensed group. Instead of properly diagnosing the disease and treating him for it, the whole group or race to which he belongs is diagnosed in accordance to the prevailing stereotypes and treated as if they are indeed the disease. The third and final thesis states that more is actually required than good intentions. The commitment to securing justice for all is everyone's responsibility, such as personal commitment is also a precondition for healing and rehabilitating the oppressed. The vague and confused elements of the North African are neither imaginary nor insoluble. They are the affliction of torment, persecuted, and oppressed persons. The psycho-existential crises are a result of cultural dislocation, economic exploitation, and a web of dehumanizing stereotypes. So Fanon's considering all the elements that are in the material world as the factors in the pathology to what's going on. It should not, therefore, be a question of looking only for liaisons to diagnose the symptoms, but also to make a situational diagnosis by examining the patient's social, economic, culture, and psychological and biological circumstances. But prevailing stereotypes have it that the North African possesses no meaningful relations, no commitment to productive labor, no subjective life, no preoccupation other than those of sex, rape, and prostitution. As for his material conditions, there is nothing but poverty, hunger, and overcrowding. Fanon includes that the North African can never be happier in Europe than he is in his home country. But contrary to what some have claimed, the answer is not reparations, so long as social and economic justice are not secured in his own land. What is more, Fanon emphasizes it is irresponsible and hypocritical to take the common view that one is neither part of the problem nor part of the solution. To young Fanon, who was then acquiring clinical skills at St. Alban, the solution to alienation and disease was nothing short of fundamental social reconstruction. There are houses to be built, schools to be opened, roads to be laid out, slums to be torn down, cities to be made, to spring from the earth, men and women, children to be adorned with smiles. This means that there is work to be done over there, human work. That is, work which is the meaning of a home. There are tears to be wiped away, inhuman attitudes to be fought, condescending ways of speech to be ruled out, men to be humanized. Any questions? We're moving on to Fanon Belinda Joven Hospital. Are you there, Joe? Let me do something. All right, I'm back. It sent Joe a message. Fanon and Belinda Joinville Hospital. Joe, no. Okay. Joe, I sent you a message. Oh well. In November 1953, Fanon arrived in Algeria and soon proceeded to take charge of the chief de service at Belinda Joinville Hospital. This was the largest psychiatric hospital in Algeria. Grismer has described the medieval and anti-therapeutic conditions of the hospital when Fanon arrived. One of the tasks Fanon accomplished in his first tour of inspection was to order the release of all patients kept in straitjackets and chained to their beds. The staff was for so long had taken straitjackets in chains for granted, could not believe what they heard. Fanon repeated the order, and he himself began to unchain inmates. The attending male nurse were shocked. Others gathered around to watch what they viewed as a brash and dangerous undertaking by a new doctor. But their fears were not confirmed by the reaction of patients, some of whom continued to lie, as if they were still chained. Fanon then introduced himself to the patients, assured them that they would no longer be kept in straitjackets or chains. Assured them that they would no longer be kept in straitjackets. Okay, informed them that he, as well as the others, were henceforth available for consultation at any time the patient wished it. This event was historic. The male nurses who were present on that day vividly recall the self-confidence of the new doctor and the deep respect he inspired in them. This male nurse were later to become the most loyal allies of Fanon and of his reforms in psychiatric institutions. It is significant to note that these male nurses were all North African. Educational opportunities denied them meant that psychiatrists had to be recruited from France. But these nurses, though regulated to menial and low-paying tasks, were in the most crucial line of contact and communication with the patients. The foreign psychiatrists did not speak Arabic, and thus relied on these nurses to translate conversations between doctors and patients. How a genuine dialogue could transpire under these conditions is hard to imagine. But dialogue was not really the raison d'etre of colonialism or such asylums. The fact of relying on low-paid, demoralized, and exploited nurses for so essential a vehicle for therapy as communication emphasizes also the low priority given to communication and therapy in this colonial institution. Significantly, Fanon did decide to learn Arabic and, what is more, later become Algerian citizen. The unchaining of inmates in Belinda is reminiscent of Philip Pinel, who soon after the first phase of the French Revolution undertook the bold experiment and unchained at Les Bicêtries. I can't say it. Bicêtries. The same action in Algeria had to wait until 1953. Ironically, to be ordered by the descendants of Africans taken away in chains. The tragedy is that to this day, many in the developing world remain chained and straitjacketed in alien asylums, almost erected by the very Europeans who proclaim their mission as civilizing the human and humanizing the world. When Fanon arrived at Belinda Joinville, there were 6 medical doctors and about 2,000 patients. The doctors were recruited from France, and all experts, all except Fanon, were European. A little more than 1/2 of the patients were also European, and the rest were North African, primarily Algerian. The European and the native, quote-unquote, patients were segregated in separate wards, and, as one would expect, in a pervasive inequities of colonial rule. European patients were given preferential treatment and allowed more privileges. Nonetheless, conditions for both groups in the institutions were dismal. The wards were overcrowded. The non-professional staff were overworked and underpaid. The doctors, as usual, were divided into packs of profiteers who gained personally from human affliction. The internal skeptics who were marking time while waiting for better posts elsewhere, and few dedicated clinicians were who far exceeded their call of duty. The dismissal conditions of the psychiatric institution at Belinda in Algeria generally was discussed by Fanon and his colleagues. In 1954, Algeria had a population of about 10 million, of whom 8.5 million were Algerian and 1.5 million were Europeans. For this population of 10 million, there were only 8 psychiatrists and 2,500 beds. 5 of the psychiatrists were in Belinda Hospital. 3 psychiatrists were in 3 different hospitals in Algeria, Oran, and Constantine. The psychiatric hospital of Belinda Joinville, the largest in the country, was designed for 971 patients, but housed 2,000. Every available space was used to reduce the overcrowding. Nearly all the refectories and even the bedrooms were used as sleeping quarters. The chapel had to be used as an occupational therapy room, a classroom, and movie theater. The mosque, too, had become the place other than for worship. The understaffing and overcrowding of Belinda also created a huge backlog of patients. In September 1954, there were at least 850 patients waiting for admissions. The overwhelming majority of those kept on the waiting list were North Africans. Europeans were admitted earlier. Moreover, an already bad situation was made worse by presuming the colonial administrators who determined that certain types of patients been given early admission, even though others in more dire need had been waiting longer. The inability to admit promptly, of course, caused serious difficulties for the patients, their relatives, and the staff. Patients in acute crises who would have benefited immensely from earlier intervention became worse as a result of the delay. The anger and frustration of relatives reduced the tolerance of the patient and their cooperation with the staff. Patients admit after a long waiting often were aggressive, a state that could have been avoided had they been admitted earlier. What is more, other hospitals refer their most difficult and chronic patients at Belinda Joinville Hospital, making it a psychiatric dumping ground. It was easy for a young doctor to be discouraged in such dismal conditions, or to join the ranks of older professionals who were comfortably settled into a pattern of indifference. But Fanon's relentlessly devoted himself, learned to sleep only 4 hours each night, to the daunting task to reform at Belinda. He endeavored to introduce reforms of a kind he saw practiced in St. Alban. The Tosquinian influence was unmistakable, at least at the beginning. Fanon introduced occupational, group therapy, and collective gathering in an effort to create a therapeutic community. In addition, he organized a soccer team in the institutions and arranged for matches with other teams in the community. A weekly outing to the beach, the serving of traditional dishes, and bus tours interrupted the crushing monotony of the incarceration, and also brought patients in measures of self-worth and social life. In addition, Fanon began a weekly periodical appropriately called Norte Journal, in which patients and staff were to express their views and exchange information. More politically controversial, Fanon desegregated his service and prohibited distinctions or privilege on the basis of nationality or race. Fanon also allowed more freedom for patients who previously were kept in close wards. The hospital grounds were mainly reserved for staff. Fanon introduced open wards, permitting free movement within the institution for all patients, except those who were violent. Those considered to be present dangers to others or to themselves were kept in closed wards. But incentives were introduced to graduate them into open wards. We will see later that Fanon had to reconsider the therapeutic value of his practice. Not only these reforms were successful, in some cases, what seemed workable and appropriate from past experience in Europe proved impractical or inappropriate in Algeria. One experience in particular drove home a lesson that proved a turning point in Fanon's psychiatric career. Fanon and Azoulay wrote about their attempt to introduce regular meetings and activities to create a therapeutic community in the Tosquinian tradition. Two separate sections, European women and Muslim men, of the hospital were followed. The 865 Europeans readily participated in the meetings and activities. The attitude of the women subsequently changed. Their interactions improved by the significant increase in rates of discharge was noted. In contrast, the 220 Muslim men failed to respond to the same reforms. The scheduled meeting of patients and service providers failed mainly due to the language barrier, since the doctor could not speak Arabic. These meetings were then abandoned. Activities involved music and drama were considered, but the nurses refused, and this in turn was abandoned. Efforts involved the patients in such activities as occupational therapy also proved unsuccessful. The marked success on the one hand and utter failure on the other necessitated some fundamental rethinking. These rapid and relatively easy successes of social therapy, introduced in the sections of European women, only emphasize the total failure of the same methods used in the sections of Muslim men, for whom, despite the multitude of attempts on no improvement took place. Little by little, it became clear that it could not be a question of laziness or of poor will. We have taken the wrong road. It was necessary to re-examine the fundamental reasons for our failures so as to find a way out of the impasse. Fanon and Azulier inquired as to why the reforms worked in one section and not in the other. Their conclusion was that they were imposing practices and methods that worked in Europe, but were alien in the North and to the North African. We naively believed possible to adopt to a Muslim society in the framework of a Western society. We have forgotten that the whole application must be preceded by a tenacious and concrete interrogation of the organic base of native society. Hold on a second, I gotta do a puzzle piece. Joe, are you there? Joe, I sent you a text. I guess they're not there. All right, well, I don't know if you're gonna get any coins, but we'll try. I doubt it. Okay, I'm sorry that's funny to you. I don't think it's funny. Fanon and Azulu then asked, under the guise of what poor judgment we believed possible, and sociotherapy of Western inspiration to serve Muslim men. They offered two basic reasons. First, they unwittingly took for granted the prevailing colonial propaganda that the North African is French, and thus they did not take the trouble to understand him in his own culture, history, and environment, as did others in the social political arena. The psychiatrists automatically, quote unquote, assumed and attempted to implement assimilationist policy. In actuality, the policy of assimilation negated reciprocity of perspectives. It imposed on the dominated party a greater burden and adapt, conform, and submit to an alien culture, outlook, and normative behavior. This indeed was what the North African patients were resisting. It was Fanon and his students' conclusion that a, quote, revolutionary attitude was indispensable, end quote, and that the assumption of cultural supremacy, which commonly undergirds clinical work, must give way to cultural relativism. Otherwise, therapy and reform become worthless and even detrimental. So they're trying to put on a type of European type policy of assimilation, and they found out that's the one thing that they're fighting against. So according to the conditions that he saw, they did an evaluation and they're now changing that condition. The second and even more important source of error was they pointed out the conceptual and cultural bias of the prevailing psychiatric thought. This was a critique of the dominant psychiatric establishment, particularly the so-called Algerian school of psychiatry. The critique at this initial period was mild and cordial. Later, it changed in intensity and tone. Nonetheless, the point was made with unmistakable clarity. Finally, and above all, it is necessary to say that those who precede us in the exposition of the North African limited themselves too much to the motor of neurovegetative phenomenon. It was essential to change perspectives, and a leap had to be made. A conversion of values had to carry out. The social therapy would only be possible to the extent one accounted for the social morphology and the forms of sociability. These observations and conclusions, written a year after Fanon's arrived at Belinda, crystallized and defined the direction Fanon's clinical work would take. In his own words, Fanon henceforth humbled himself to the native culture, and rather than be arrogant or indifferent, became timid and attentive. This Antillean, who from birth was a hostage to European culture, history, and conceit, had made a remarkable leap in in time, geography, and values for a homecoming to the shores and cultures of Africa. Fanon subsequently undertook studies in ethnopsychiatry, writing on such topics as the attitudes of North Africans to the wildness and sociology of perception and imagination, the psychocultural meaning of confession, and the search for effective clinical intervention in the developing world countries. The 1954 article Fanon's in Azuli was clearly more than a clinical study on therapy outcome. It was in addition a theoretical and ideological act on the French psychiatric establishment generally and the Algiers School of Psychiatry in particular. Fanon's single-handed but relentless battle with the dominant psychiatric establishment, whose views and treatment of the North African were thoroughly colonial and scandalous, has not been sufficiently participated. In fact, few of Fanon's psychiatric writings fail to include, directly and implicitly, a critique of the dominant psychiatric establishment and its extension into North African context. At issue for him were a series of theoretical, ideological, and clinical problems in approaching the new African patient, the community of which he is a member, a role of psychiatry in the colonial social order. It is important to note that the earliest and most persistent opposition to Fanon's reforms within Belinda came from the European doctors and the colonial administration they represented, with the exception of Dr. Lucantin and a few interns. The European doctors at Belinda were either openly hostile to or quietly resentful of Fanon. They opposed his efforts to change the status quo within the institution behind his back. As Grisner points out, some of them even referred to him as a, quote, Arab doctor, end quote, which was their way of calling him a N-word doctor with the ER. It would be a mistake to consider their resentment and opposition as only idiosyncratic reaction or interpersonal differences. Although no such doubt existed, there was also a more fundamental clash of perspectives, interests, and allegiance. Belinda Joinville Hospital was actually a microcosm that reflected the larger colonial society of which it was a part. The iniquities of the privileges and power, the racial segregation of patients, and the differentials in salaries that for years characterized the institutions were extensions of what prevailed in the larger colonial society. Indeed, the patients were individuals who somehow could not cope or be coped within that society. Their crises and certainly their incarcerations were implicit but poignant social and political commentary. The psychiatrists, too, employed by the state and themselves embedded in the social cultural milieu, were by no means operating in a social vacuum or employing only their, quote, technical expertise. There were variable representatives of the prevailing social order, as their patients were the most obvious victims of it. It was inevitable that Fanon's idea and clinical reforms could constitute a challenge to the prevailing colonial framework and his Eurocentric values. The challenge first took root at Belinda Joinville Hospital, advancing further into the challenge of the larger psychiatric establishment. Earlier skirmishes with it not sufficing. I'm gonna make sure. I don't know if that's sufficing. I think it's sufficing. If Joe was here, I don't know where Joe went. I think it's sufficing. Make sure.
Suffice.
Yeah, sufficing. And then culminated in the direct political violent challenge of the social order itself. Thus, Fanon's decision to join the liberation movement must perforce be viewed partly as a determination to liberate psyches he saw doomed to psychological death in Belinda. His struggles against the European doctors in Belinda. No, the guy's not here. To must be considered along with his persistent struggle against the Algiers schools of psychiatry and the larger French psychiatric establishments of which it was an extension. Significantly, the founders of this influential school, Professor A. Perrot, was also one of the founders of Belinda Joinville Hospital, giving that this was the largest psychiatric hospital in Algeria, and that Perrot elaborated his own medial educational establishment. It would not be too far-fetched to conclude that the European doctors in Belinda were colleagues, students, or at least sympathizers of Perrot and his school. Now what indeed was the Algerian School of Psychiatry about? Why did Fanon become its most formidable challenger and critic? And how did Fanon singly handle, effect, and remarkable change in French psychiatric outlook? Fanon, and it has a whole bunch of like French words like L'École d'Alger. I can't say it, everybody. I'm so sorry. The guy left. So I don't know where they're at. All right, here we go. Barth O'Leary, can't say his name, 1979, has reviewed psychiatry in colonial Algeria and Fanon's revolutionary role in the raging battle of ideas within Algeria that prized French colony. European psychiatry has had a relatively longer history in Algeria than in most African colonies. This had to be partly with the greater penetration of colonialism into Algeria, where French settlements effectively installed in Algeria, and the party with an earlier presence of Algerian immigrants in France. Moreover, as colonialism became established in Algeria and Algerian psyche's assimilation into French culture intensified to a point where efforts were made to assimilate Algerians' wildness into French wildness. For at the very early date, many Algerians who suffered from mental disorders were sent to asylums in France for treatment. French psychiatrists wrote little about the psychopathology of an Algerian before 1870, but writings about Algerian psychopathology increased as Algerians, in the throes of a psychocultural crisis, appeared in significant numbers in French asylums as Algeria became the important colony of France. Among the earlier works in French psychiatrists, a few show a measure of a culturalist approach to the Algerian patient and of a wish to understand him in his social context. But the most persistent and dominant trend was that which asserted the genetic inferiority, unredeemable criminality, sexual perversion, and mental deficiencies of Algerians. So that's the whole pseudoscience of racism. The Algerian as a subhuman being, a bundle of perverse instincts, giving to dangerous and uncontrollable impulses. Such characterizations were used to justify colonial violence and subjugation. The historical functions of these writings was to justify European conquest, scientifically and more specifically, to fortify the Manichaean psychology, the black and white, of French administrators, settlers, and citizens. The Europeans as the embodiment of all that is good, rational, peaceful, and sublime, was juxtaposed with the colonized native as an incarnation of evil, irrationality, impulsive violence, and beastly instincts. Thus, the instance Malhon concluded in 1915 that the Algerian, though less prone to self-unaliving, was a greater susceptibility to alcoholism and sexual perversion, and that his psyche was doomed to be irreversible, degenerative process. Assholes. On the characteristics he emphasized was a dangerous impulsivity among Algerians. It is a question of a sudden instinctual, unconscious, blind action. It is a sign of cerebral inferiority, which is congenial, contingent, inherent to the race, and found only among European patients who are inferior and degenerate. End quote. Earlier, Constance, 1873, who had clinical charge of Algerian patients, stated, quote, "They are all so dangerous and violent patients that we are obliged to put them in the worst cells or cages to contain them, and we have to treat them as wild and ferocious beasts." Damn, that sucks. That's a horrible thing. This view of the Algerian as genetically inferior, dangerously impulsive, and incurable prevented became a widely accepted tenet in the 19th century French psychiatry, and continued to be affirmed, reaffirmed, and embellished for nearly 80 years from the conquest of the independence of Algeria. What is remarkable is how little the racism of French psychiatrists changed during these years, and how the same claims, often made the same words, have been reiterated with the aura of science and the zeal of a crusade. The most blatant expression of this racism is found in the influential remarks of Boigi, a captain physician, who wrote on the pathology of the Algerian and claimed that Muslims, quote, "never created any extraordinary things, never erected a capital, never built up a navy fleet, never studied deeply in any science, never durably embellished, as did the Europeans, any part of the world." And that's incorrect, because we know that Muslim people went to the European countries like Spain to get them out of the dark age. Plus, they have the oldest library and universities. Like what? He also characterized Muslims and hence Algerians as intellectually deficient, fanatic, homosexuals, child molesters, masturbators, and also unpredictable murderers, assassins, and terrorists. In summary, Boigi concluded, quote, "The mental state of the Muslim is a mixture of varied doses of wildness and tangled in delusion. For those who go to the mosque, they are all violent, wild persons who are in a state of somnambulance." Gotta look up that word. That's a long ass word too. Long one. Joe, why aren't you talking? If I do this. Nope. Joe must have. It must be. I hope they're okay.
Hello.
There you are. Where you been?
I'm just talking to Scott.
Okay.
I'm gonna mute, but you know that because I was on Discord, it's gonna probably make it where I can't talk again.
Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Somnambulant.
Somnambulant.
Some.
That's the word. Somnambulance. Boigies, I don't know, it's Boigey', falsified history and distinguished racism could well be dismissed as a raving and of a psychotic, bigoted man. One can easily surmise that his rabid racism was no doubt related to the fact that he was actively involved in the pacification of North Africa. But more significant, the historic was the fact that Boigi's racism and crusade against Algerians and Muslims generally were to be reiterated for many years by French psychiatrists, most notably by A. Perrot and his Algerian schools of psychiatry, writing about Algerian psychopathology in 1918. Perrot characterized the Muslim as a liar, thief, and non-intelligent, who was lazy, wild, and impulsively homicidal. In 1932, Perrot elaborated on the murderous impulsivity of the Algerian native and identified the following causal factors. inherent mental debility, extremely crudelity, crudelity. I can't say the damn word. Sorry, everybody. That's why you're supposed to be here to help me. No. Credulity. A tendency to be too ready to believe that something is real or true, especially without adequate evidence. Credulity and suggestibility. Perversion. I can't say the damn word. I know what it says, I just can't say it. Someone's supposed to be here to help me, but no. They won't let me say it. God. Perseveration. Which means the involuntary, repetitive continuation of thoughts, behavior, or speech pattern after the original stimulus that caused it has stopped. Okay. And the weakness of affective as well as a moral life. The Algerian were said to be infantile, without a curiosity, questioning of European children, a horde driven by an instinctual impulse towards murder and perversion. Perrot gave scientific trappings of these claims when he asserted that, quote, the native of North Africa, whose superior and cortical functions have hardly evolved, is a P-word creature whose life, primarily vegetative and instinctual, is mostly dominated by his, I can't say his name word. Lots of words. So basically, he's just being a racist pig, and he's using like science to say that he's right. Diencephalon. What the hell is diencephalon? A deep region of the brain situated between the cerebrum, and the brainstem.
Diencephalon.
4 years later, Perrot reiterated the same conclusion in almost the same words. Quote, the Algerian does not have a cerebral cortex, or, to be more precise, he is under the dominance of that word. Oh my gosh, again? Diencephalon. Where did it go? Oh my gosh, hold on. There it is. Okay. And as one would expect to find any inferior vertebrate, the gut racism of the ordinary European was not only given scientific respectability, but was also intensified by Perrot. The scientific racism Perrot institutionalized in Algeria was to remain dominant for nearly 40 years. Perrot's students and contemporaries simply reasserted and embellished the notion of Algerians specifically and Muslims generally are inherently inferior. Any deviations from this ossified and sanctions bigotry, involved not a change in substance, but at best a touch of paternalism. Thus, for instance, Frenblanc, writing in 1927 about the North African middle class, concluded, these men, in one word, are big children. They have all the qualities of shortcomings, but in an extreme way. Trustful, ineffectual, generous, disinterested, full of touching spontaneity, unconcerned about past or future. They are also vain, liars, cowards, sometimes artful and thieves, but mostly emotional and suggestible. to the highest degree. What an ass. Real quick, we're gonna see how far we got until the next. Just real quick. Okay, remember 236. 236. Come on. Okay. We're gonna probably go a little bit over 4 more pages. Actually, what am I doing? Let me just do this. So everybody bear with me if you want to. Okay. Perrot's stature and power grew as he developed in Algeria, a medical educational institute, to justify the ruthless victimization of Algerians, and moreover, to institutionalize those to whom Europeans projected that they found unacceptable in themselves. What is remarkable is that Perrot assertions years earlier, repeated many times subsequently, were again reiterated as late as 1960, and in the work of Aubin, Aubin, who was supervised by Perrot himself. By lack of intellectual curiosity, cruelty, and suggestibility reach an extreme degree. Same fatalism aggravated the initiate and acceptance of a non-civilized for work. Their, oh my gosh, abulian, where their compressiousness and their impulsivity. This bunch of racist shit. In short, as Berthier summarized the scientific racism, French colonialism needed a justification, was effectively, quote, born around 1908 by Boingui's article elaborating in 1918, completed in 1935, rediscovered in 1939, but also in 1947 in the thesis of Sunain in 1948 by Barnett, as well as in 1960 with Aubin's writings. The remarkable thing is that all this rubbish was written in the name of science and by otherwise rational, well-respected authorities. The characterization of the Algerian is a, quote, not intelligent, thief, liar, suggestibility, and all such imaginable mudslinging from Perrot and his school was nowhere as influential as the theory that the North African was a born criminal. The later claim that was given by semblance and credibility when one looked at the high rate of homicides among colonized Africans. Fanon arrived in Algeria at the time when Perrot's stature and influences were formidable. The scientific racism he had elaborated were firmly established in the psychiatric circles, and the school he founded was producing trainees who tended to echo his pronouncement. University students, and particularly medical students, had been taught these, quote, scientific truths about Algerians for well over 20 years. When Fanon arrived in Algeria, the colonial administration and the settler, of course, found Perrot and his scientific proofs, quote unquote, most congenial. Anyone who deviated from this beaten track or who questioned its tenets was thus suspect within the dominant psychiatric circles in Algeria, and certainly insofar as the colonial administration was concerned. Fanon nonetheless stood his ground against this powerful psychiatric colonial legacy. We have seen the critiques of Mannone that Fanon had written long before he arrived in Algeria. Mannone's racism and justification of colonialism were in fact more subtle and sophisticated than the rapid and crude racism elaborated by the Algerian School of Psychiatry. There seems little doubt that Fanon, now more experienced and committed than when he wrote Black Skin's White Mask, would sooner or later write a cogent critique of Perrot and analysis the socio-historical function of his ideas. We have seen that the paper he wrote was Azulie year after he arrived in Algeria, as an initial and somewhat mild critique of the French psychiatric establishment. If disappointment with Tosquelian reforms in Belinda was not applied, the critique of Perrot emphasized on, quote, motor and neurovegetative phenomenon, end quote, was certainly unmistakable. Fanon came back to the same critique of the Algiers School of Psychiatry in subsequent works. Okay, a paper Fanon presented before the first Congress of Black Writers and Artists in Paris on September 1956 placed racist claims like those of Perrot in a social historical perspective. He suggested that the racism of colonial intellectuals involved two stages as colonialism attained a measure of sophistication. First, in its crudest form, cultural and anthropologists declared that the colonized had no culture at all. This was followed by the affirmation that all groups have culture, except there is a hierarchy of cultures, whereby a given culture, of course European, is better or more advanced than others. Each of these claims correspond to the level of socioeconomic relations between the colonizers and the colonized. The psychiatric claims that there is no cortical integration in the colonized. More specifically, Carothers' depiction of the African as a, quote, lobotomized European, end quote, is simply a anatomical, psychological counterpart of the second stage. As the struggle of liberation intensified, one begins to hear assertions of cultural relativity, an assertion that signals the emergence of reciprocal recognition between peoples. A few years later, the Wretched of the Earth, Fanon returned to the same issues and directly focused on Perrot and the Algiers schools of psychiatry. This letter critiqued its particularly important for at least two reasons. First, we see which the numerous indictments of the Algerian Fanon chose to answer. Second, more importantly, we find a further elaboration of Fanon's explanations for the high rates of crime among the oppressed. Fanon's explanation of why there is high rates of intrafamilial violence and homicide among the oppressed is of particular significance in light of the data we present in Chapter 8. And because other theories thus far offer in the literature are not as convincing, Fanon began with a response to the common claim that the colonized is lazy, or that his efficiency and work habits are deplorable. Violently protesting these stereotypes, some intellectuals among the colonized sought to show that black people, Algerians, the colonized as a whole, are indeed great and committed workers. Fanon argued that such a defensive reaction was unnecessary and in any case missed the point. It is time to stop remonstrating and declaring that the N-words is a great worker and that the Arab is a first rate at cleaning ground. When the oppressed are lazy and inefficient at work, they are in fact sabotaging the oppressor's system of design. A biological level, that these acts constitute a remarkable system of auto-protection, quote unquote. Indeed, under conditions of oppression, the exploited farmer or worker who is so intense at his work and refuses to rest is a pathological case. This laziness and inefficiency of the oppressed is a form of passive resistance, quote, a concrete manifestation of non-cooperation, or at least a minimum cooperation, end quote. They are indicative of the stage when the oppressed has not reached, quote, the maturity in political consciousness and decided to hurl back oppression, end quote. It is at this stage of passive resistance, that the oppressed make sure that any amount of labor and, quote, the slightest gestures had to be torn out of him, end quote. One can see here how Fanon disagrees with Hegel on the meaning of work under conditions of oppressions. For the former, the devoted laborer and oppressor exploits is a sign of pathology. For the latter, it is a royal road of self-objectification and perhaps liberty. According to Fanon, the oppressed also sabotage and the prevailing laws, the payment of taxes, the dominant morality. To obey the oppressor laws, civil forms of morality, is to undermine oneself, while to contravence them is a form of resistance, albeit an undeveloped one. Claims that Algerians is a liar, a thief, a man never to be trusted, were no doubt stereotypes of the oppressor, elaborated to fortify this Manichaean psychology and to justify his violence. But also, no honor, no dignity, no self-respect remain for the oppressed, who actually are depersonalized individually and collectively. Honor, dignity, and self-respect are restored only in the framework of a national liberation struggle. Such a struggle mobilizes members for the common purpose, galvanizes them into a cohesive group, and integrates them into their own moral imperatives. Thus, as long as political consciousness is not attained, the oppressed remain in despair. In turn, it turns out that lies, thievery, and other forms of rudimentary resistance are rampant. One aspect Fanon discussed in some detail concerns the claim of Peratt and his school that the Algerian specifically, and the North African generally, is a born criminal who promptly by, oh my gosh, I think this is the same word. Hold on. We're almost done, everybody. I'm sorry. I started late. Is that it? Oh my gosh, just lost it. There it is. Okay, I gotta just change it out, I think. Okay, hold on. Sorry. Phalic. Oh my gosh. LIC, not K. Of course, it's not gonna let me do it. It's the arrow game. Diencephalic. Oh my god. Diencephalic. It means a rate relating to a situated, oh my gosh, and a, oh, this is the other word. Urges and brutes instincts, kills frequently, S-wordly, and for no reason at all. These claims, Fanon emphasizes, have been affirmed in various international conferences and told Algerian medical students for over 20 years. Fanon reviewed this claim not only to show their, quote, poverty and absurdity, but also to clarify important theoretical practical problems, that there had been a high rate of criminality among Algerians, Fanon included. But he showed that this high rate of historically and socially conditioned. Fanon pointed out that before the national liberation struggle, one noticed an appalling intensity and rate of crime among Algerians. Much of this crime occurred inside a, quote, closed circle, a relative, friend, neighbor, or acquaintance. It was an intra-group phenomenon. An Algerian victimized another Algerian. During this period of low social historical consciousness, the oppressed Algerian was unable to realize and face his, quote, true protagonist. In fact, because oppression permeated everyday living, the oppressed tend to serve each other as a screen, and each hide from his neighbor, their national enemy. Each came to personify the oppressor, his image and reality. Each served as a convenient, available target for his neighbor's pent-up anger and frustration. But the more often this occurs, the less the oppressed found the need to identify and face his true protagonist. Oppression frustrated all basic needs and made each Algerian the enemy of the other. Hunger brought intense competition for each loaf of bread. The obsession with food and the struggle to eke out the tenuous existence took priority over everything else, including morality and higher ideals. One looked not to history nor to the future, but rather to the tyrannical demands of the famished belly, the heart-rending cries of the malnutritious children, and the accusing glances of a wife with dried-up breasts. Under these circumstances, to steal is not an aggression of morality or of law, but rather a way of meeting basic needs, and at the same time committing murder, at least symbolically. The rage of violence engendered by such circumstances could, of course, not simply be wished away. One had to find some target for pent-up frustration. Yet, for an ordinary Algerian, the actual oppressor were practically and socially inaccessible. The police, laws, and threats of prison, the actual invasion by armies and tanks, shielded the oppressor against the anger, frustration, and violence of the oppressed. Each Algerian, therefore, turned his rage at himself, his loved ones, and his neighbor. Thus, the exhausted and exploited laborer who came home discovered that the cries that deny him the rest he sorely needs were those of the Algerian child. The countless unemployment who competed for his job with Algerian. Hold on a second. The local judge and or the policeman who harass him to pay overdue taxes were Algerian. Everywhere, every day brought overwhelming feelings of rage and profound self-hatred, and empowering temptation to kill, and an Algerian who could serve as an immediate, convenient target, as each act was a murder symbolically or actually. Each murder was also a self-unaliving. Fanon asserted that the appalling rate of crime suddenly declined during the War of National Liberation, as national consciousness, I can't talk to you right now, Aiden, as national consciousness and collective will from liberty took hold among the populace, as a true comrade and a true enemy became differentiated, as a demarcation between the self, that is every right to life in its own land, and that the other, who ostensibly is alien and unjust, was brought to the light of day. The smoldering rage became appropriately canalized, and the rampant violence redirected to its logical target. And in effect, the War of Liberation nationalized all effective cognitive, behavioral, and material resources. The oppressed who previously saw the enemy in himself and his neighbor instead found the comrade in himself and in his neighbor. The oppressed who previously was an isolated individual obsessed with food and physical survival, which in any case eluded him, was later to show remarkable generosity and self-sacrifice. In short, Fanon presents a incentive critique of Perrot and the school he founded. He exposed the crude racism and justification for colonial oppression in their claim. Moreover, Fanon showed that the seemingly incomprehensible and reprehensible behaviors of the oppressed were meaningful and often justified reactions of oppression. The crime of the oppressed cannot be explained by instinctual and disciplinaric urges, but rather as reaction that have lost purpose, and an appropriate target can be transformed into creative and liberative actions. The impact of Fanon's exposition in French psychiatric circles is suggested by Berthelot, What Perrott was only able to keep secret, Fanon denounced in the extreme, completely engaged in the struggle against colonial alienation. It is for a good part thanks to Fanon that a number among us have at this moment become aware that the Algerian and Bogolili, I can't say that word, were not necessarily synonymous, and that the colonized man was first an alienated man. With Fanon will remain the merit of having clearly stated that the Western model was not an intangible dogma in psychiatry, that the pathology of the Algerian Muslim was inseparable from the analysis of the society which surrounded him, and that an honest approach to mental illness emerges inevitably through the knowledge and understanding of culture from which it emerges. And that's the end, everybody. 15 minutes over. About the same time. And we're going to stop on page. Thank you, Fanon. So you see that, like, when they started to actually do their revolution.
The page number?
Yeah, I will. 242. So you see, when they started doing their liberation process, they started to turn from away from themselves and each other, because they knew where to act and how to act. Not how to act, but what to act on. Okay, no one came up. Yeah.
All right. So if I know that you can't give me like a summary, but like, can you remember like any points?
Like what exactly? That the that Fanon was pushing against the status quo of the psychiatric leadership within the French colonialism and stuff. Like, he was pressing against their racial science and of them, and how they interpreted like North Africans and Algerians as criminality and all those bad things, and children waiting to be, you know what I mean? So it's just that same kind of approach, but Fanon's challenging that instead, you know? And he also is telling us like how deep enthralled these people are learning from, like 20 years to 50 years of this stuff. And you have like students coming out of that, going there and utilizing and implementing these practices, these racist practices, as like scientific actualities. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you very much. Cool.
Yeah.
That sounds like, I'm so proud of Fanon for fighting back. Because yeah, all that racism that's in psychiatry, I mean, it's still in psychiatry today, so it needs to be fought against.
I think personally that Fanon should be everybody. It should be like Fanon 101 psychiatry should be like, it should be a priority. If you're becoming a psychiatrist, a doctor, or any of those things, it should be like you have to do it in order to combat the racist pseudoscience of the medical institutions.
I agree, very much.
Yeah. Because Fanon combats all that bullshit science that's like not conducive to the actual reality, you know. But I could be talking to my ass. I don't know.
They should at least have a book. You should at least have to read a couple of books from Fanon while you're going through.
Yeah, I agree. But I could be talking about my ass. I'm just going off what I interpret it. I could interpret this completely wrong. And if anybody wants to come up, they can come up and help me interpret it better. I can't say talk today. Interpret it better. Yeah. So. But I don't think anybody wants to come up. I think everybody's left. Yep. All right. I'm going to go ahead and close it out. Thank you.